My name is Alana, and I use they, them pronouns.
And my name is Jessie. I use she, her pronouns.
And we're making menches.
Making Menches is your home for queer, anti-Zionist Jewish ritual, radical education, and community.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Making Menches. It's been a minute, and we are so excited to return with today's episode. Today, we're going to be talking to Aiyana Masla, who sings, gardens, and divests from harm, from disconnect by practicing rest. She also works and plays as an interdisciplinary artist, an intergenerational community member, and an anti-bias educator. Aiyana is an interdisciplinary artist, but today we are talking to her specifically about her poetry and the new book she released, The Underdream. We're excited to have our collaborator, Jessie Taylor, back with us, joining us for this interview today. Aiyana, we are all so excited to be talking to you today. Tell us what brought you to this work and what inspired Underdream, which is the book that we're going to talk about today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor. What has brought me to this? A lifetime of being in a body on this earth, in this time that I'm alive. The Underdream specifically is a collection of poems that emerged during acute illness and presented themselves, came through me as a part of my navigating really stressful, difficult, challenging period of time being in a body on this earth in these times. And poems were how I entered and stayed with the challenging experience I was having. They were how I stayed with myself. They were how I was able to survive the experience that I had in a big way. I would say they were just as important as the medical treatments and recovery process that kept me alive. Art in general, creative work in general, has been for the last decade or so that I've been navigating big illness and chronic health stuff. It has been a really integral part of my healing, my aliveness, my wellness, my staying here in the body.
That's beautiful. And that sentiment really comes across, I think, through your work. And I think brings at least this reader back to my own body through your work. So thank you for transporting us. I'm so curious how the title, The Underdream, came to you. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
My initial resistance to first being diagnosed with chronic Lyme disease and having my entire life upend and everything I thought I was in control of empty out and shift. But then in 2020, in the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, I got really, really ill. And after about 6 months, was diagnosed with active pulmonary tuberculosis. And the amount of resistance that I initially felt to what was happening, what was occurring in my story, in my life, resistance feels like an understatement. It was so scary and overwhelming and stressful to have pulmonary tuberculosis during a respiratory pandemic living in Brooklyn, New York City. And initially, I wanted to be able to control what was happening. I wanted to be able to have this sense of agency that I felt attached to around what my life looked like at that time and how I was moving forward, what my plans were. And I really had to yield and surrender and let go into a completely different day to day in order to treat the TB, in order to recover more than just physically, recover emotionally, spiritually from the trauma, from the experience. I really needed to get out of the way and allow something else really authentic and really true to change me, to happen. I needed to become a dream of myself that I was not planning for and that I did not anticipate. I think my relationship to my temporarily able body before I had Lyme was full of assumption. And I want to say this gently towards myself, but forgetting the temporary nature of being in my body. My first encounter with chronic illness brought me a little bit of understanding, actually quite a lot of understanding, but the TB kind of felt like another layer, so much deeper, came through to, yeah, shape the Underdream. It was the Underdream of what I thought I wanted, what I thought I was doing, who I thought I was, and really showed me a important and very life-changing understanding of myself on this planet, in this body, at this time, which was predominantly around presence and realizing how the productivity, the ideas of all of this activity and productivity that I had going on before I got really sick fell away, had to. And with that, there was the opportunity for me to realize my worth outside of racialized capitalism, outside of our society, outside of inherited Jewish trauma of don't rest, outside of ways I was socialized. Yeah, inside of our culture. I had to find a different sense of worth and purpose, which was shown to me really actively by the natural world and by the accompaniment of the natural world. Just like the tree is just being the tree. The sky is the sky. How glorious. How fucking glorious. It's just the sky. It's not doing, it's being. And that sounds so simple, but it was heavy to really integrate and to let go of my identity as a doer. And that's not to say it's completely gone. I still have patterns, but I really learned something around purpose and presence that changed me. And that was the Underdream underneath the dream that my identity had.
Thank you for sharing that. I love the concept of an underdream. Something that I was thinking about a lot while I was reading the book and in reflecting about the book and in talking with you and hearing you talk just now is this concept in Judaism called Hit Bodhi Dude. I hope I'm saying it right. Fingers crossed. Which is this, I think what it translates to is something along the lines of like talking to God on your own terms. But in practice, it's, to me, is really just like a noticing of the world around us and like a mindfulness practice almost. Very nature-based, very like, how can I be in this moment with this other living being? And that living being is a tree, a blade of grass, or like the person that I pass on the street in the city. And that was something that like felt very present for me in your book, even if not intentionally. I was wondering if you could share more about how or if Judaism has influenced some of the themes in the Underdream. Things about like death and cycles and presence all felt really relevant to me.
I would say this particular collection of poems is not explicitly Jewish, but I'm Jewish. So it definitely gets woven in to the shape of my perspective and the way I'm metabolizing, digesting, responding to the poems as they come through. And I think for me personally, a really tremendous way in which my sense of Jewishness comes through when I think about your question, when I think about the book, is the difficulty I had both times I became quite sick, but particularly the second time, with slowing down and allowing a real Shabbos to occur and not what was modeled to me because of trauma, and actually deeply slowing down and exactly the practice you're speaking to, connecting and allowing myself to be touched by existence and to connect with the great, incredible wow through very simple and mundane objects and people and places and things, and really slow down enough to realize how actually miraculous and beautiful it all was, which then yields poems. So the natural world in particular being a really incredible accompaniment and guide and resource for this. And the times I have read about that practice you're speaking to, I realized that I've been doing that since I was a really small child, particularly going out into the field or to the sea or going into the woods and talking directly to God, for lack of a more translatable word. And when I was really close to my mortality and really close to the potential or possibility of dying, which we will all experience, that conversation became enhanced. I felt more permeable, more accessible, more broken open to a tenderness and an availability to that conversation, which I think has happened many times in moments of hardship for me. And I've witnessed it in loved ones as well, like a loss or a breakup or the state of the world. Anything that really causes grief and grieving invites a lot of availability for that conversation with God and that deep listening. And my experience is that if I could really stay there and be transformed, and for me, that looked like writing poems, it created a lot of room for wonder, for awe, and made my heart bigger ultimately rather than contracting it through the trauma. I'm still in a moment in my life as I release this book. It's really amazing how this message that has come through this book, that came through that experience around slowing down and presence and connecting, is still working its way through me. And my nervous system is still learning this new map. And yet, the capacity to stay in that conversation and return to that conversation again and again has created more space for me to imagine and appreciate and give my attention towards this world as beautiful and as kind and as something I have such great affection for.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that. It was deeply resonant, first of all. So much of what you just said reminded me of how I felt reading your book and how I felt this underlying theme of navigating liminal spaces. You spoke to it just now a bit about the deep listening you feel while being in the space, questioning your mortality, thinking about the space between life and death. You explored in your poems as well. Would you say that while crafting these poems, you were exploring ideas or feelings related to liminality? And how does liminality as a space, as a concept, and mode of being impact your art, if at all?
Deep question. My art and poetry has been a tool for me both to support resilience and to praise, and creative work in general has such potential to move us. And for me, poetry has been a way I enter, whether that is the grief I was just speaking to or the presence that I was just speaking to, but it is a way to enter. And not only enter, but I feel that my experience has been that it also transforms in some way. So for me, particularly with writing this book, but with most creative projects, there's a real touching and emptying that's happening through the creative process, whether that's anxiety or avoidance or physical pain or a difficult situation or limitation in some way. Entering through creative work brings me into that liminal space you're speaking about, which then allows everything to shift if I can stay with it, if I can stay there. And particularly as a process, sometimes I get snagged by creating something I can share, creating a product. And I notice that the process is really where the richness happens for me, because I am inside of this liminal space that is a space in between conscious and unconscious, in between being attached to a feeling or a story and releasing it, in between being fully in my body, in whatever state my body is in, with all of its limitations, and feeling that expanse that is also present and true, in between feeling as if I'm observing the tree or the field or the river or the blade of grass, and actually being interconnected and a part of. And the last thing I'll say in response to this deep question is that in many ways, slowing down as a practice, rest as a practice, is deeply intrinsic with liminal space and with the creative process for me. I've noticed, I've been working on another book, and I'm noticing when I get sort of revved up into a much faster and impatient even approach to the editing process, and how that's just really not working for me. And so bringing in and integrating rest and slowing down into the creative process is definitely a skill I'm working on, and find yields such an abundant perspective.
Thank you. And I love that you mentioned your creative process, because something that I also noticed while reading was that so many of your poems, they illustrate processual moments or experiences of process, whether it's becoming or emptying, as you just mentioned, sometimes undoing, or just general transformation. What would you say your relationship to process is?
Oh, being alive. Also, the Underdream specifically was not clear to me as a collection or as a book while it was being written, while it was coming through. I knew something important was coming through, and writing poems every day or most days, as I said earlier, really did participate directly in my treatment and in my recovery. But I didn't have a linear sense, and I often don't have a linear sense of where I'm going when I'm engaging in process or in a transformative experience, like creating a book of poems out of a life-threatening illness. I think I was wondering if I was going to survive, and I was wondering what needed to communicate itself through me and through this experience. And it didn't seem like somewhere I could get to rationally. And it didn't seem like somewhere I could get to by trying to directly or in a practical kind of like head way explain or tell the story of. I needed to really enter it and be inside of it, and be almost, the image that's coming to me is like when you're wading out into the ocean and the waves are big and they're tossing you around. And I needed to let go into that experience. What I'm really wanting to say in response to that question is that I think it's important to me to practice an embodied returning to again and again, trusting that transformation is happening when I stay and when I keep returning to presence.
You already spoke a little bit about the importance of rest in your practice and the importance of rest in your process. Alana and I are two overtaskers. We're not even multitaskers. We just overtask ourselves a lot, and have been in this year embracing rest more and trying to force ourselves to go slower. So I think reading through this and getting towards the end, encountering Spell for a Slower Life really, hit me in the chest, basically, to, think through my own relationship to rest, urgency culture, all of it. And so this question is really asking you to expand even more on the relationship between urgency and hustle culture and poetry, and how poetry and rest can play off of each other.
I am in this story in my body because of being an overtasker. Let's just be clear. I have not found the answer. I'm writing the poems because I'm practicing. I was just saying to someone the other day, like, you are so good at resting. And she was like, I know, I love resting. And I was like, I am so deeply jealous right now. How can you just so easily offhandedly say, oh, yeah, I love resting? I think she said, I love resting. I love being cozy. And I was like, I want to feel that confident about that statement because I know that it's so vital to my sense of connection. And I strive, I aspire. Poetry definitely is an accompaniment in that practice. Especially, I feel like, especially with hustle culture fostering so much loneliness and disembodiment by nature, poems can really surprise us. And for me, when I'm writing them, surprise me by touching my basic aliveness and inviting me in deeper to the conversation that we spoke of around talking directly to God and the natural world and in daily life and with anyone. There's a real opportunity for me when engaging with art, engaging with poetry, either receiving it, reading it, witnessing it, or creating myself. There's a real opportunity for me to not only enter a liminal space or be transformed or be touched and empty, but also be moved and almost guided back into this other lens. Art and creative process, creative practice, and poetry is accompaniment, is companion, is guide around presence. And I don't know how I would remember to rest and to slow down without the capacity to be touched by art or creative work. Imagination and slowness are so linked. There's awe and wonder in the task of slowing down, but first it's often excruciating. And particularly because of our society, there's grief. And it can be deeply uncomfortable. I experience it at times as incredibly agitating because there's so much there that I'm holding in my body and just pushing through and moving through in order to keep up with our cultural pace that's so revved up. And when I slow down, there's a real way in which my body and I have to get really fiercely human. Sometimes that looks experiencing its limitations and experiencing my capacity. And sometimes it looks like really allowing myself to feel how heartbroken and in love with this world I am. But that always opens something for me. So I do trust it, and I'm getting deeper in the practice of it. And I can feel that happening. And I'm very, very grateful for that. The more I practice, the stronger the practice becomes. So yeah, ordinary miracles really come through in that slowness.
Getting deeper into your practice, going back to what you were saying earlier about the resistance you were facing to this practice, would you say that in some way when art and poetry are your accompaniment in these spaces of deep listening and presence, your companion, would you say that in a way that you've ritualized your artistic, poetic praxis that comes through in the poetry, this acknowledgement of the power and beauty and accessibility of ritual?
I actually think I came to an understanding of the practice of accessible ritual through my writing practice. I think that there's been a fierce dedication in me to creating, to art, and sometimes I felt like it was really impractical and it didn't make sense for a way to spend so much of my time or energy. And yet there's a way in which I'm consistently returning again and again. And that's when I realized it was a very spiritual practice and that it was creating fortitude. And in that way, ritual, and particularly this phrase accessible ritual, became more available to me when I realized how much of a spiritual practice my art practice is. It's so sacred to me, and it creates so much more of a sense of inherent belonging and is my way of offering. And I'm feeling kind of like emotional as I say that because there's so much artist oppression in our culture. And there's so much vulnerability in saying that. I'm just like, oh, is it enough? And yet, there is something very important and powerful in continuing to engage with the imagination. I really do believe in our collective capacity to imagine a more beautiful and a kinder world. And art and poetry are ways that we do that. There are ways that we connect with each other around that imagining as well.
When I was reading your poems, it was a multisensory experience. And I'm wondering if in this state of presence, this deep listening, if you're writing them and it feels like a multisensory experience for you. And I'm curious which of your senses inform and influence your creative practice, if any more than others, maybe, and just what that experience is like for you when thinking about things with all of the senses, or even maybe some senses we haven't named yet.
Yeah. I think in a lot of ways, this particular book, The Underdream, was an attempt to enter a shared field, an experience that a field we all will enter, of being in a temporary body with its limitations and encountering our mortality and death. Because there is so much isolation in being sick in particular, there's so much isolation around our culture and ableism. I wanted to reach out through the poems because I knew I wasn't actually the only person, having an experience with my limitations in my temporary body, navigating the medical system, being in pain, being afraid of death, being excited about the access point that the poetry could provide as a way to make connections when there's often just so much disconnection and isolation around, particularly around chronic illness in my experience. I think encouraged me to get really deep into the layers of my body and what viscerally and physically I was experiencing to create as many access points as possible into the presence of the poem and what the poem was reaching for and trying to say. And I think specifically, I have a task in this life to return again and again to being in a body. The sensory experiences are almost like their own access points. Again and again, I'm sort of entering through them. So I often use that almost as a mindfulness practice in my work. Okay, what is the smell? What is the sound? What is the texture? What do I see? What do I sense beyond that within myself and beyond myself? The last piece I'll share in response to this deep question is that in navigating a really stressful and traumatic and overwhelming experience like the TB during the beginning of COVID, I think that there was a real pull for me to I was in a very vulnerable space in a lot of ways. And there was a real pull for me to need to eject myself from my body or disassociate or avoid or fantasize or just get out of the experience in the ways that I could, because I felt really, in the beginning in particular, really stuck in the circumstance and in the context. And so my practice, in addition to rest and in addition to letting go to the under dream of what I thought I wanted, and in addition to reaching for connection in so much isolation, my practice was also staying in my body and really trying to give myself permission to be numb when I needed to be numb and to notice when it was becoming more than a necessary coping strategy, but more of like a habit, and to really try and return and get present again. And so poems being such an incredible way to enter the sensory experiences were also very highlighted during writing this book, because I would often return to presence and to being in my body in through the portal of whatever sense was strong in that moment.
Earlier, you mentioned you weren't sure whether you were going to survive or not while you were writing this book, and art and poetry became this ritualized practice for you as you were moving through. You also mentioned that you felt that poetry was a way to praise, to move us, and to transform. Would you say that creating art or writing poetry have ever felt like prayer to you or been a form of prayer for you while navigating all of this?
Yes, I have felt that. It really relates to Ilana, will you remind me how to say the talking to God practice?
I think it's a hit Bodhi dude.
Yeah, great. It is
That.
that. And then the lineage, the incredibly potent lineage of poetry, and all of the tutelary spirits and muses and teachers and beloved poets that I am honored to learn from and walk in the footsteps of, coming together. So that conversation with God and the practice, the technique, and the way of perceiving, the way of presencing, the way of embodying that is deeply prayerful, I would say is a huge part of what my practice is. Sometimes I write a poem and I'm like, oh, I wrote a poem. Actually, often. I'm like, oh, it's a poem. And I think prayer is like that for me. I'm like, oh, I'm praying. I, yeah, I needed this. I'm praying. And when I was a child, I prayed. I was so religious. I prayed all the time. I was always talking to God. I prayed before meals. I prayed after meals. I prayed before bed. I just loved that connection and that communication. And, being socialized into the world, that practice dimmed for me for a while. And now, as an adult, reclaiming prayer in a lot of ways it happens through art and through poetry. But it's also so delightful and amazing when I realize how much sustenance it provides. I don't know why sometimes I feel resistant to praying, where I'm just like, I'm too tired. I don't want to do it. It feels challenging or hard. And I don't know how much of that has to do with my relationship to tradition or assimilation, but there's something there, some sort of block that happens. And so when I'm surprised by the connection and the nourishment, it feels really similar to when I'm surprised by a poem. And sometimes often the two are related.
You mentioned like influences to your poetry and poets that have inspired you that you draw from. I'm curious if you can share about any poetic inspirations, art inspirations who have felt particularly like present in the Underdream or to you in your writing process in your life.
Yeah. So many. I have a poetry teacher who calls them tutelary spirits. You have so many tutelary spirits. And I love that you asked specifically in regards to this book, because they're like guides. They come and go at different moments. So depending on what I'm working on or what I'm reading, even what I'm immersed in my life, I'll be more influenced by certain poets at different times or certain artists at different times. For this particular work, I was drawing a lot of strength from Araceli Skirmay and her book, Kingdom Animalia, which is one of my favorites, actually. I just said it was just in this experience of writing The Underdream, but I return to that book again and again. Yeah, that book has touched me in a very deep place in my imagination with craft, but also with content. And a poem of hers called I Am Not Ready to Die Yet, alongside a poem by Joy Harjo, who was the poet laureate around the time that I was writing this, also called I Am Not Ready to Die Yet. These poems really influenced one of the poems in the book called
Don't I know which one it is? It's my personal favorite. As soon as you said what you said, I was like, yeah. Okay, keep going.
That's beautiful. I notice in my daily writing practice that whatever I'm reading, which I start the day by reading poems and writing, is very shaped by what I'm reading. So whatever I'm writing is shaped by what I'm reading. And then I have a few tutelary spirits who are constant, like Araceli Skirmay and like Joy Harjo. I also was really shook by Time as a Mother, which was Ocean Vuong's book that he released around that period of time. I saw him do a reading in Western Mass, and he spoke about beauty. He was reading from the book. It's his second book of poems. He was speaking about beauty and how vital to our survival beauty is, and that we know this intrinsically. We bring flowers to people when they're ill or when they've died, for example. Something about the approach to beauty and loss and grief in that book really hit something for me during the time of writing The Underdream. Speaking of approach, John O'Donohue, who is a poet and I can't remember what type of Christian mysticism right now, monk, I think, wrote some really, really beautiful text about approach and awe and wonder that really influenced me in the writing of this book as well. And I did a lot of listening to recordings of chimes and bells while I was writing this book, which I don't know that I could explain to you why it was so important, but it was, looping back to this question of ritual, there was something I was really dropped in by with that sound and that reverberation of like wind chimes, specifically wind chimes, that allowed these poems the space they needed to come out and come up, come through. I also really, really enjoyed the poetry of conversations, like noticing. I do a lot of eavesdropping. I think before navigating a lot of chronic illness, I did a lot more performing as an art form and a lot more, I guess you would call it like extroverted art making. And I think with doing a lot of acting in particular and performance art stuff, I got really into the practice of observing people and tracking how they're walking and their certain habits in their body and the way they talk. And I'm just very, very fascinated by people and have a real eavesdropping problem that started as a creative practice. And now my wife said that my drag name should be Eavesdropper, which is real good. So eventually, when I get into drag, I will go there. Anyways, I love snippets of conversation and piecing them together and noticing phrasing and noticing, especially when something vulnerable is shared and I have the privilege of witnessing it in public space, because it wakes me up to how tender we all are and how interconnected we all are and how there is so little and so much difference between us at once. And that's really powerful to remember, and I think influence my poetry a lot.
First of all, no one steal Eavesdropper from Aiyana.
Thank you for
That
that.
was too
Copyright.
good.
That's a good name. I'm actually starting to drag myself. So when you said that, I was like, oh, that's a good name.
I'm excited for your drag, Jesse. Oh my goodness. Thank you for that answer. I love the listening to chimes and bells. Sometimes I listen to loons when I'm writing because I had like a teacher a really long time ago who would put out loon sounds. And I love the idea of something like that being an inspiration as well, and like something that was infiltrating the work. And I think eavesdropping of it all is so significant to the human experience. When you said that, I was reminded of the poem Senora's Roses, and like that to me feels like such an example of the like, yeah, literally the slowing down and noticing this human being having an experience in the world that we share together, that I just found really, really beautiful and special, especially in a city like New York, anywhere, but especially in New York when things move like so fast and there's so many people we pass in one day. To like really slow down and notice someone is significant.
It felt so particular to be, while writing the Underdream, to be living in New York, in the city. It was really dramatic. Like, what is happening? And like, what a beautiful opportunity to be going so slow while everyone else is accelerating ahead and by me. Yeah, it's a beautiful contradiction.
I feel like you have left listeners with so many incredible messages. So I hate to do this to you, but I have to ask the final question we always ask on the podcast, which is, if you could leave our listeners with one message, what would it be?
The practice of being present and returning to the present moment is an incredible way to be alive. Is enough, is an offering to this earth and to our world. And presence allows us to connect to and imagine a kinder and more beautiful world. So, yeah, your presence is your purpose.
That felt so full circle, thinking about what you said in the very beginning about the tree just being the tree.
You're right. I did say that. Wow.
That grounded me so much when you said that, because trees have been my everything. And so when you said that, I was like, oh, I'm locked in now.
That's amazing.
Yeah. I love that you came full circle with that.
The unconscious poet in me had to.
Aiyana, thank you so much. I feel like this conversation was, I mean, I was just mostly listening. I was so immersed in it. It just felt like, I don't know, like a soothing ball to like listen to. So many parts of it feel like reminders I'm going to have to come back to, which is how I felt reading the Underdream too. And so I'm really hoping that people listening are going to be like, oh my God, I have to read this book, because you do. Where should people find the Underdream? Is there like a place where you're like, I want you to get it here? And where can they find you if they want to keep up with what you're doing and, yeah, support you?
Thank you. The Underdream was published by Cornerstone Press. And honestly, what's really awesome is if you go to your local independent bookstore and you request it, or you go to your local library and you request it. Because what that does is it communicates to the publisher that people want to read the book, but it also spreads it more. Then it's in that bookstore, then it's in that library, and then perhaps more people will find it. Yeah, it's available anywhere books are sold, and requesting it specifically is really special. You can find me on the internet. It is my full name.com, AiyanaMasla.com. I am sometimes on social media. Yeah, I'm findable if you Google me. I really love it when I hear from somebody who read my work or heard me, or like a note it's so meaningful, because so much of this particular art form, poetry, is so, it feels so private, and then it's so vulnerable to put something out there and just have no idea where it's landing and with whom. And every time that I hear back a resonance like you all shared means so much. It's like deep nourishment, deep spiritual nourishment. And so my email is through my website, and contacting me there really means so much when that happens. It's so special. Working on my second book of poems, working on some other projects, and excited to connect in whatever way that happens. Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to articulate some deep in there and deep out there feelings, ideas, concepts. It's really special. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Making Mention. Please consider supporting our work by funding us. You can find the donation link on our website, makingmenches.com. You can follow us on Instagram at Making Menches. We host monthly Shabbats both in person and online, so make sure to sign up for our newsletter, which is on our website, to get updates.
Making Mentions, the podcast, is produced by Alana Lipkin and Jesse Sander. Intro music is by Nate Sander. Editing by Jesse Sander.